I am truly, truly pleased, I am blessed to be able to stand here before you this evening and talk to you about how I came to know and love Buford Delaney. Buford Delaney, the man, Buford Delaney, the artist. Buford Delaney, the bridge between New York and Paris, the bridge between Knoxville and Paris. What you see on the screen right now is 4 self-portraits by Buford Delaney. I love to open my talk with this slide because it shows you how Buford viewed himself as he went through time. 1944, 1950, 1964, 1970. There are several additional Buford Delaney self-portraits that you can find around the world. And I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about what I have come to learn about the man and about his art. So my talk is called Buford Delaney, From Paris to Beyond. And the beyond part I'm going to talk about later in my presentation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Buford's history from a chronological standpoint. I'm going to show you pictures of Buford's Paris, which the Knoxville contingent that came to Paris earlier this year in February, March, a little bit of what they experienced. And then I'm going to talk about really the origins of my interest in Buford. So Buford was born here, obviously, Knoxville, Tennessee, in 1901. He moved to Boston to study in 1923 with the help of Lloyd Branson, one of your most famous artists. He moved to New York City in 1929 during the Great Depression, and he was there until 1953 when he moved to Paris. And he moved to Paris not because he was seeking to leave the United States, but because he was going to visit a friend, actually in Rome, and stopped in Paris and decided that he would stay there. And that's a fairly common story among African-American expats in Paris. And he died in Paris in 1979. A few days to weeks, we don't know exactly how long, he stayed at the Hotel Odessa. But he moved just around the corner and down the street, like a block and a half, to this hotel, which was at the time called the Hotel des Écoles. It is now called the Hotel Lenox, and this is where he had his first studio. Richard Gibson, the man that you see on your left, was the friend of Buford Delaney who actually told me about Buford's gravesite, which I'll talk about much later in this presentation. And you can see a portrait that Buford did of Richard Gibson on the right. He did that portrait at the Hotel des Écoles, his first studio. This painting, by the way, was in the Minneapolis Institute of Arts show that came to Knoxville. I think it was in 2004. Here you see Richard Gibson's wedding party. Richard Gibson was the man who was living in Rome at the time that Buford came to Paris. And Buford never got to Rome to visit Richard Gibson. Richard Gibson relocated to Paris, and that's where they eventually met in Europe. This is Richard Gibson's wedding party, and you can see Buford. If you look, Richard Gibson is the man in the front row on the right, and if you look directly above his head, you can see Buford there sort of looking up and to the side and grinning to himself, and I just really wonder what he's thinking about there. Ed Clark, another dear friend of Buford, who was also, or who is also an artist. He's a living artist. I think he's 90 years old this year. And you see on the left a photograph of Buford with Ed Clark at an exhibition called Trois Noirs USA, Three Blacks USA, that was held in Paris in 1969. And on the right, you can see a view of a building where Ed Clark lived immediately across the street from the Hotel des Écoles where Buford lived. So they were neighbors, literally across the street from each other. And Ed Clark had a studio at the top of the image that you see there. He actually called it the chicken coop. The Dome is one of the 4 cafes in the Montparnasse area that it's famous in its own right, but this was one of Buford's favorite cafes when he lived in Paris. And at the time, it was quite inexpensive. At this point, the Dome is the most expensive cafe on the street. The Coupole, I think everybody's heard of the Coupole. This was a cafe that was, at the time, the most expensive of the 4 cafes in the Montparnasse area, all on a boulevard about a block apart. 2 on one side of the street, 2 on the other. The Dome and the Coupole are on the same side of the street on the south side. And I was always told, well, initially I was told that Buford could not afford to go to La Coupole, and so he wouldn't have been found there. But as time has gone on, and as I've met artists, European artists, and some American artists as well, who have contributed information to the blog, they told me that they met Buford at La Coupole. And the reason that they were able to meet him there was because Buford was invited to the table of successful European artists who hung out at La Coupole. So Buford was not able to afford to eat at La Coupole himself. The best that he would be able to do would be to go to the American bar, quote unquote, and stand up and have a sandwich. But people have met him at the tables at La Coupole, which were out of his reach financially, but he was invited by these various artists. This is a photograph, portrait and photograph of a man named Colin Gravois, an American from New Orleans, who was a friend of Buford. Buford was a generation older than Colin, and Colin has contributed 3 stories to the Les Amis blog. Colin told me that Buford did his portrait and that he failed to retrieve the portrait before Buford was committed to St. Anne's Hospital. He wondered what had happened to the portrait, and he described it to me, and he said, I was wearing a green jacket, I can remember it vividly, and he said, and I always wore my watch on my right wrist, and Buford captured that in that portrait, and I have a photograph of myself somewhere sitting beneath the portrait that Buford did of me. And I thought about that, and I went through several of the catalogs that I have of shows done that honor Buford, and I found the image of the color portrait in the catalog that was for the 1978 retrospective of Buford Delaney works that was held at the Studio Museum of Harlem. It was the first retrospective that was ever done of Buford's work. And Colin is still splitting his time between New Orleans and Paris. And you can see him, a photograph of him, a current photograph of Colin. I say current, it was done in 2010. He is speaking at Buford's gravesite ceremony in October 2010. The Select was another of those cafes that Buford spent a lot of time at, particularly during the last 10 years of his life prior to being committed to St. Anne's Hospital. It was also a favorite cafe of Ed Clark. And the American Center for Students and Artists was a place in the neighborhood, perhaps about a 10-minute walk away on Boulevard Raspail, where there was a lot of avant-garde activity going on with regard to art, photography, poetry, theater, and Buford was often found at the American Center. Colin talks at great length about the American Center and Buford's involvement there. And Henry Louis Gates Jr., who contributed an essay to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts catalog, describes how a fellow young student, when I say student, I mean university student, told him that he absolutely had to meet this man named Buford Delaney. And it's a very poignant essay. Buford was in the Hotel des Écoles from 1953 to 1956. He then moved to a suburb of Paris called Clamart, and you can see Clamart in that, it's colored in yellow. So it's sort of southwest of Paris, and he was there from 1956 to 1961. Many of the paintings, many of the abstract paintings that you will see that have a predominant red theme were done in Clamart. Buford had an episode. He always heard voices from a very young age, and those voices were tormenting voices. And when he traveled, those voices became aggravated. And Buford took a trip in 1960 to Greece. He traveled alone. He was going to see one of his patrons, Dorothea Speyer, who had invited him to Greece to do some painting. Buford attempted to commit suicide twice during that trip. And he was fortunately found, and Dorothea Speyer had him hospitalized in Greece until he was stabilized and able to travel. She paid for his passage back to Paris, and he underwent further treatment there. This was the end of 1960. And in 1961, he moved into a studio on this street, Rue Vercingétorix, which was purchased for him by another of his patrons. This is what the area where his studio looks like today. The neighborhood was entirely redone. The church that you see on the right side here was there at the time that he was living there, and I understand that several of his sketchbooks have many, many, many sketches of this church. This is what it looks like today. This is what the building looked like when Buford lived there. The entire neighborhood of Montparnasse, from the beginning of the time that it became popular with artists until the 1970s, looked more or less like this. The reason that artists were able to live there was because it was cheap. Okay, so a patron of his purchased a studio at this address, paid lots of money to fix up that studio. So Buford's particular studio was actually fairly nice, not elaborate by any means, but certainly not dilapidated like this. But the entire neighborhood more or less looked like this, and it underwent urban renewal. Yes, and it contributed, actually that urban renewal contributed to Buford's psychological descent into madness, for lack of a better word, because he was no longer able to recognize his neighborhood. As more and more buildings were torn down, he was unable to understand that this actually was where he lived. And people often had to bring him home. They would find him wandering in the street, and they would have to bring him home. Henry Miller was a dear friend of Buford from the 1940s in New York through the end of his life. And Henry Miller visited Buford at that studio at Rue Vercingétorix. This is a portrait, it's a self-portrait actually, of Buford Delaney, but you can see that it looks very much like Henry Miller. Rue Vercingétorix was also a street where one of Buford's dear friends, Larry Calcagno, lived. Calcagno was also an artist. For the 100th anniversary of Buford's death, an art exhibition of Buford's and Larry's work was done. It was mounted by the Palmer Museum of Art, and it traveled to 4 additional museums. Buford was really happy that he was going to be living at Rue Vercingétorix because he knew that Larry had lived there prior to his moving there. This is a photograph of Larry Calcagno in the middle of the boat. Another artist friend of Buford, Charlie Boggs, at the back of the boat, and Buford in the middle, and they are on a trip to Venice. Buford's friends took him all over Europe. One of the things that he benefited from was the benevolence of many, many, many friends. And amongst the things that they did for him was to take him on trips, Spain, Italy, Austria. Buford traveled extensively through the grace of his friends. Interestingly, Charlie Boggs lived on Boulevard Montparnasse, the same street that those four, the cafes, the Select, the Dome, and the Coupole are on. And when he and his wife divorced, in this place, Cité Falquière, which was actually very close to Buford's last studio. And I found in the archives just a couple of days ago a contract between Buford and some person. I can't remember the person's name, but Buford actually signed a contract for space in this street, Cité Falquière, and I need to do some investigation on that. So I remember reading that he actually rented a place where he could store some of his work because he was so prolific and he was just running out of space at his studio, and I suspect that that's what this contract is about. Montparnasse Cemetery is a place where many, many, many famous people, primarily artists and literary people, are buried. It's the second largest cemetery in Paris, and Buford would walk across this cemetery many, many, many times a week because to get from his studio, Rue Vercingétorix, to his favorite cafes, the Dome and the Select, across the cemetery was the fastest route. And he knew some of the artists who were buried there. Up in the right, upper right, there's the tomb of Man Ray, the photographer from, excuse me, the Dada and Surrealist photographer. And Buford did know Man Ray. And at the bottom you see an image of the sculpture The Kiss by Constantin Brancusi. Buford knew Brancusi. They were actually friends. They talked a lot about their philosophy of art. And that Brancusi is buried in Montparnasse Cemetery as well, and also his sculpture is there. Reed Hall is the place where I co-organized the 2016 exhibition of Buford's work, Resonance of Form and Vibration of Color. You see the courtyard of Reed Hall there. This facility belongs to Columbia University, and its official name is now Columbia Global Centers. And I was thrilled to find out during the exhibition itself that Buford had probably been there and attended concerts there. And at the bottom left, you can see an invitation that is among his archives for a concert, a singer, a soprano singer, accompanied by a clavichord and a clavichord player and a pianist, that took place at Reed Hall in 1973. These are just a couple of pictures of the exhibition at Reed Hall. We had two rooms there. The upper left was the salle de conférence, and the bottom right is the grande salle, the big room. And you can see me at the podium there addressing people at the opening. Here are photos of the Knoxville contingent. Yes, and it was so moving for me to be able to say to all the people in that room, we have 11 people from Knoxville, Tennessee in this room this evening. So you can identify yourselves. I'm sure you can recognize people. But it was a fantastic event. Just a couple of photos of Buford in his studio. You may know that even when Buford was in New York, he draped his studios in white sheets or whatever white that he could find so that he could maximize the light in his workspace. And in the upper left over there, you can see him sitting in a chair. I don't know the layout of his studio, but you can see paintings around him. You can see a huge tree behind him, and you can see in the front and at the bottom, and even the chair itself draped in white. And on the bottom right, there's just another photo of Buford in his studio. Buford was committed to St. Anne's Hospital in 1975. These are some shots of the hospital itself. This is what it looks like today. This man, Jean-Luc Messica, is an artist who was a friend of Buford, and he attended one of the events that I organized during the February-March 2016 exhibition. And you can see him in his studio standing next to a portrait that Buford did of him. And on the right, you can see a bigger image of that portrait. That portrait will travel with the itinerant Buford Delaney exhibition to the United States. And so you will be able to see it in person here in 2018. This is a photograph of Buford and James Baldwin at St. Anne Hospital, taken in 1976. The artist that I showed, who I just spoke of, Jean-Luc Messica, was present when this photograph was taken. During the event that I hosted, it was a celebration of Buford's personal life in Paris. Jean-Luc Messica stood up and talked about how Baldwin and Baldwin's entourage refused to give him information about Buford's health and essentially told him that Buford was none of his business and that he need not concern himself with what was happening with Buford Delaney. He has given me extensive interviews about that. It hurt him. His recounting of that was so poignant that several people in the aftermath of that event called me or emailed me and said, "Who was that artist?" His story was just so heart-wrenching. Jean-Luc Messica is a man who is still an active painter. He's 80 years old today. He splits his time between Paris and New York. And he is going to help me to discover whether or not there is artwork by Buford at St. Anne Hospital. Just a little bit more about Baldwin. Baldwin and Buford are intricately linked. And when Buford came to Paris in 1953, he and Baldwin reunited at this cafe, the Café de Flore, in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which is another area of Paris, still on the left bank, but a little bit north of Montparnasse. Buford has done many, many, many portraits of James Baldwin. The one that you see on the left is hanging, or I don't know if it's being displayed, but it's at the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian. And on the right, you can see a photograph of Baldwin and Buford, and in the background, a man who's grinning widely with a big mustache. That is James Baldwin's brother, Wilmer, and they are at an event at the American Cultural Center during the 1970s. I don't have an exact date, but Buford was often featured and honored at the American Cultural Center in Paris. This is an archive of Buford. It's Buford's paint box, and you can see it at the upper left, and there are some photographs in there, and you can see at the bottom right a blow-up of the photograph at the bottom of that paint box, and you can see Buford over in the corner in the left. You can see James Baldwin standing next to him. Next to Baldwin is a man named Johnny Romero, who owned a club called Les Nuages in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. And then next to Johnny Romero is James Baldwin's brother, Wilmer Baldwin. The Abbaye is another place that Baldwin and Buford hung out together, again in the Saint-Germain-des-Prés area. And it was owned by the African-American man seated and playing the guitar, Gordon Heath. Gordon Heath was a Shakespearean actor, but he was also a singer. And his lover, Lee Payant, and he owned and operated L'Abbaye for many, many years. A little bit of Buford's art. This painting is at the Whitney Museum. It was done at that first studio, the Hotel des Écoles. It's a pastel on paper, the year that Buford moved to Paris. This painting is called Composition 16, also done at the Hotel des Écoles. This painting is the painting that drew me into Buford's art. When I learned about Buford Delaney, I was interested in his story because he was a mentor of James Baldwin and because he was an African American artist who lived in Paris. When I saw this the photograph of this painting, I felt as though I felt as though somebody had reached into my chest and just grabbed my heart. It was the first time that I had ever had a visceral reaction to art of any kind. And it made me revisit everything that I had ever learned about Buford Delaney, because I didn't understand until that moment what Buford Delaney's art meant. And if it could touch me, who does not have an art background and who really, that's pretty, this was my turning point with regard to Buford's art, and it really is why I'm standing before you today. If you visited the 2004 exhibition, you know that this is the raincoat painting, the famous raincoat painting that Buford did again at the Hotel des Écoles, where he was so impoverished and not able to buy materials for himself that he cut up a raincoat that he was given. When it was so shabby that he couldn't wear it anymore, he cut up the raincoat and made it into canvas and painted this fantastic abstract. And you can see at the back of the painting, you can see the pocket of the raincoat in this corner. Yeah, and you can see a seam. You can't see the seam here because the stretcher is blocking it. But if you are standing in front of that painting, you can actually discern the seam of the raincoat. Buford had several solo exhibitions in Paris. This is just a list of them. Here he is standing in front of one of his abstracts, a large abstract that was shown at a 1961 exhibition hosted by the Paul Fichetti Gallery. Paul Fichetti was the second gallery owner who was a huge supporter of Buford. And Dorothea Speyer was the biggest art dealer or art gallery owner who was a patron of Buford Delaney. You see what you're looking at is the facade of her gallery. And on the right, you can see a long list of the artists that she supported. And Buford's name is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 on that list. Dorothea had many, many paintings done by Buford at the time that she had to liquidate her gallery. She fell into ill health and had to move back to the United States. And there was a huge auction of all of her possessions at Christie's. And these 3 paintings were among the paintings that were sold at that gallery. And the portrait of Vasilika Pikula was in the Paris exhibition in February, March, and it will come here when Knoxville Museum of Art welcomes this exhibition in 2018. Dorothea Speyer commissioned a lot of paintings from Buford so that she could support him, so that he would be able to live. On the left, you see a photo from the invitation card of a 1973 solo exhibition that she mounted of Buford's work. And on the right, you see a portrait of her done by Buford. This is the invitation card for the 1992 solo exhibition, done posthumously, and obviously another self-portrait of Buford. Just a couple of pictures of Buford at the American Cultural Center, which was run by the U.S. Embassy. Buford is in the middle of that painting, and you can see him surrounded by friends. And you can see at the back there's a wall that was painted, and it says, "We love Buford," in white at the top, and then in black in much bigger letters behind all the people that are standing there. And here you can see Buford standing up. I don't know what's going on in this particular scene, but he's obviously very pleased. I imagine that somebody is talking about him on the podium, and he's standing up and acknowledging their words. So beyond Paris, and I'm going to tell you now the story about why I came to know Buford Delaney. My husband and I have a travel planning service called Discover Paris. And for Discover Paris, we specialize actually in the African diaspora in Paris and gourmet Paris. And so the gourmet part is why everybody had such a good time eating when they came to Paris in February. But in 2009, I was writing an article about African American grave sites in Paris. And here are a few of the grave sites that I included in that article. Richard Wright, Arthur Briggs. This actually on the bottom right is not a grave per se, but it's pertinent to Buford's story. This is the Garden of Remembrance in the Père Lachaise Cemetery, and people whose ashes are, whose niches for ashes are not renewed, have their ashes sprinkled in this garden. On the bottom left is the grave of Victor Séjour, and it's one of the very few graves in Paris that is preserved in perpetuity. Okay. Here we have Sidney Bechet's grave. We have Henry Ossawa Tanner's grave here. And at the bottom we have the Jardin des Souvenirs in the Thiers Cemetery, which is where Buford is buried. When I learned about Buford Delaney through the fact that I was doing this article, I wanted to include him because he was a friend of James Baldwin. I had heard his name only in relation to James Baldwin, and I knew that he had come to Paris. He was an African American artist among many, but I knew that he was buried somewhere in the Paris area, and I wanted to include him because of his relationship to James Baldwin. I contacted Richard Gibson, the man who I showed you earlier in this presentation, who was a personal friend of Buford, and I asked, Richard, can you tell me where Buford is buried? He couldn't tell me exactly, but he said, but I know who can tell you. I visited the grave, but I can't remember the details. Let me get you the exact information. He came back to me with the name of the cemetery, the division, and the actual row on which the grave was located, and he asked me, is Buford still there? Okay. In France and in other countries in Europe, your grave is not permanent. You lease your grave. Someone has to pay for you to remain in that space. And the term can be as short as 6 years or as long as 25 years or 50 years. It is extremely rare these days for anyone to be buried in perpetuity, okay, as Victor Séjour was, and he died in the 18th century. The 19th century, sorry. So I got the information, I went to the cemetery. This is what I found. I was unable to even discern where the grave was. I was not aware that the grave was not marked. I had to ask guards to show me how the cemetery worked, because the system is that you're on line 1 or line 2 and you're space number 40X or whatever, and it's not marked in the cemetery where line 1 is. So I'm there, I'm wandering around, and plus this particular division of Thiers Cemetery, which is enormous and which has several divisions which are full of just the most elaborate tombs that you could ever see, in contraposition to this particular division, which was all weedy and weeds up to my knees, literally. You can see the weeds are taller than that grave that's to the upper right. It was incredible. And 2 guards independently walked off the spaces and came to this little area here where you can barely see a ceramic flower arrangement. That was Buford Delaney's grave. Buford's friends asked me whether or not Buford was still there. And I went to the cemetery office and I asked, and they told me, well, who are you? Who are you? Are you family? No, I'm writing a story. We don't have to tell you anything, you're not family. I said, well, can you at least tell me, is the exhumation, is there going to be an exhumation? They relented. They told me finally, well, he's going to be exhumed this year, but they wouldn't tell me when. I went back to Richard, and Richard spoke with the other friends of Buford Delaney, which is what Les Amis de Buford Delaney means. And they said, well, can we save the grave? If he's still there, can we save it? And it only cost 274 euros to pay up the back rent, so to speak, on the grave. Buford died in 1979. I am there in 2009, 30 years later. And it just so happened that they were going to exhume him that year, okay? I was able to pay the money. His friends were so excited that they said, well, let's place a stone. Can you find out what that would take? I'm the only person in France. Richard Gibson was living in the UK, the other friends of Buford Delaney in the US. By this time, I'm totally enthralled with this story. I'm enthralled with their stories about Buford and why they care so much, and how they tried to have him buried in Montparnasse Cemetery, which is where James Baldwin would have had him buried had he had the money. And all of this, and just being overwhelmed at seeing the condition of the grave. So I said, I did the research. We found out that we could do a stone for several $1,000s, not quite 10,000. I said, I'm willing to go through this procedure, but I'm not going to raise the money in my name. I don't want that kind of money coming into my bank account under my name. So I created the organization Les Amis de Buford Delaney, which is a French nonprofit, in order to raise awareness of Buford's story and to give legitimacy to the fundraising effort. And so what you see there on the left is a photograph of Buford taken by Carl van Vechten in 1953, just prior, well, maybe a few weeks prior to him setting sail for Paris. And then this print here is the announcement that comes out for all the official nonprofits to announce to the world that this is actually a nonprofit that is recognized by the French government. These were the goals of Les Amis de Buford Delaney: placement and maintenance of a tombstone for the grave of painter Buford Delaney, payment of the renewal fees for his grave, organization of commemorative or educational events in his honor, and informing the press and the media of his life and his accomplishments. So that's really what I was doing with the blog. This is TA Cemetery. You're looking at the front gate here. It's a magnificent cemetery. It's quite beautiful. It is extremely large. What you see in the bottom right here is the conservation office, which is where I went to inquire about whether Buford was still buried. He's in Division 86, and these are some scenes, or some shots rather, of the division as I found it when I went there for the first time. In July 2009, it looked like what you see over there. I went back to the gravesite in September of 2009, and they had at least mowed the division. And you can see the ceramic flower arrangement better. I came to understand that flower arrangement was placed there by Sue Canterbury, who was the curator of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts exhibition. This is what Buford's grave looks like today. We preserved the ceramic flower arrangement, and it is placed, if not glued or anything, it can be moved, but it sits on the tombstone that we placed there. There's a tiny photograph of Buford from his New York years on the tombstone, and the inscription reads Buford Delaney, peintre in French, which means painter, and it's in French and English, peintre, painter, 30 December 1901 to 26 March 1979. Born Knoxville, Tennessee, USA, died Paris, France, and the quotation is, "I am home." This is just a shot of the blog. This is the blog Les Amis de Buford Delaney, which I created in 2009, and I'm still writing today. Photographs of the gravesite ceremony, October 2010. So you can see we had a small group of people come out to the cemetery, and Colin Gravois was one of the people who spoke there. And then we all went back into Paris and had a reception at the Hotel Talleyrand, which is the former home of the American consulate. The U.S. Embassy gave us that space, and the U.S. Embassy, I have to say, was very supportive throughout the whole fundraising campaign. So we were able to celebrate Buford in an official U.S. space. A year later, we celebrated Buford, the 1-year anniversary of that event at the Select, which was Buford's favorite cafe for the last 10 years of his life prior to him being committed to St. Anne's Hospital. Here we have a photograph of the Hotel Le M, which was formerly a restaurant called Les Mille Colonnes, and this is where the Knoxville contingent stayed during the February-March exhibition. And you can see on the right one of the 2 plaques that we had placed in Buford's honor. It says, Buford Delaney, portraitist and abstract expressionist painter, born in Knoxville, Tennessee, USA, frequented the restaurant Les Mille Colonnes at this address in the years 1950 to 1970. The second place where Buford stayed when he arrived in Paris in 1953 also bears a plaque that says Buford Delaney, portraitist and abstract expressionist painter, born in Knoxville, Tennessee, USA, lived at this address in 1953. Resonance of Form and Vibration of Color was the show that I co-organized with an art, a private curator and gallery owner in Paris, Laurent Chocot. What you're looking at is the cover of the catalog for the exhibition. Yet again, a self-portrait by Buford. And we organized this exhibition not only through Les Amis de Buford Delaney, but also through my nonprofit organization, my U.S. nonprofit organization, the Wells International Foundation. I call it WIF for short. And WIF has 6 strategic focus areas, and the ones that are in rows are the ones that we incorporated into the exhibition: the arts, STEAM education, and study abroad. We had students come from the University of Arizona to Paris to create an augmented reality app, a digital app that you can access for free. And you can use that app to find or to access additional information about half of the paintings in the Resonance of Form, Vibration of Color exhibition. Each painting that has an augment is marked by this orange. It's an icon of a smartphone, and the B stands for Blipar, which is the platform on which the augment is housed. So this painting, for example, is one of the paintings that is augmented. This particular painting is augmented by a spoken word artist who I asked to write a poem inspired by this work, and he recites that poem in the video augment that you can access using Blipar. There were 20 paintings and works on paper augmented in this show. The show was 45 works, 40 of which are in the catalog. 4 of the augments are of the spoken word artist. 16 of them are of me, talking about some aspect of that particular painting or something about Buford's life at the time that he painted that work. So, what I want to say just in closing is that when the exhibition comes to Knoxville, we are going to have, those augments are going to be in place. What we're hoping to do is to have the same professor from the University of Arizona come in with a new team of students and augment Buford Delaney works that belong to the Knoxville Museum of Art. We're also going to have, with regard to STEAM education, the exhibition in Paris brought K through 12 teachers to Paris to learn about art integration and using art to teach science, technology, engineering, and math. We want that same organization to come to Knoxville to bring teachers from other places in the United States and to work with teachers who are working in STEAM in Knoxville to build an educational program around the exhibition here. And obviously, the arts themselves are based on Buford's art. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here in Knoxville to kick off the fundraising and to kick off the PR and to kick off just the groundswell of interest and passion about this show, about Buford, Buford's life, about Buford's art, and about this show. And I know you're having an exhibition of his work in 2017. The show in 2018 will be a continuation of that, and I'm hoping that all of this will be a volcanic eruption that makes Buford just a tangible asset is not even really the right word. To have his hometown be a place where people can come and learn about him and learn about what he represents for us as artists, what he represents for us as a human being, what he represents for us as a bridge between so many different cultural aspects of our existence. Connection between the United States and Paris, connection or France, connection between Black people and white people, and people of all races, connection between men and women, connection between gay people and straight people. Buford has it all. His story is just so phenomenal, and I really hope that we can establish Knoxville as the place where, or one of 3 places, as Stephen said earlier, where people can come and learn about this extraordinary man. If you have any questions, I'll take them.